All right, great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I think it's probably morning no matter where you are, right? So good morning. Happy Tuesday. I'm pretty sure it's Tuesday, right? Okay. My name is Nikki Miller. I use she, her pronouns. I think I probably met many of you at your first module with this MAVA training. So we're here today to talk about managing risk. In case I didn't catch you in that first training, a little bit about me. I have worked for Planned Parenthood for over 20 years. Most of that time was spent working in leading our, at the time, 3-state volunteer and intern program. So lots of history working with volunteers and interns and working with our communities. I actually 5 or 6 years ago moved into working in our HR department, not with volunteers. So right now I'm working as the interim VP of organizational effectiveness. So a lot of similar concepts that I really learned in my years leading volunteer programs and community programs, but now working with paid staff. So that's just a little bit about me, and really excited. I love this training series. Has a lot of really useful concepts that I still draw upon years after attending the training myself. So I hope you have a similar experience. One thing, just one little piece of housekeeping for me, in case you're wondering where I am right now. I am in a camper, but I'm not camping. It's a camper in my driveway in Hudson, Wisconsin, outside the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And so yeah, nothing too fun or adventurous. I just needed my own space, so I moved into my camper. That said, my internet occasionally drops out a little bit, usually pops me right back in. But if you ever find if I'm getting choppy or you can't hear me or I drop out, it's usually just for a couple seconds. Feel free to come off mute. Whoever catches it first, come off mute and just let me know, because sometimes I will just be talking and talking and talking to no one. So just let me know. And it usually, if it happens at all, I usually pop right back in after a couple seconds. So just wanted to put that out there. Give everyone permission to be chill and relaxed if that happens. No emergencies there. Okay, so the other thing I want to share, so for this training, and I think for if you were in the other trainings, you probably have some familiarity with this as well, but I use Menti to just add some interactive features into this presentation. So the way that you can use it is either in another browser window or on a mobile device or at another laptop, whatever you choose. Anything with a browser, just go to www.menti.com. And I'm going to ask you to enter the code once you're there. It's up on the screen, 50109493. And just as a little icebreaker, I'd like you to log on and share how are you feeling this morning. All right, coming in, motivated, determined, fresh. I like that. Comfortable, fine. Okay, outstanding, determined. All right. Ugh. Yeah, I've been feeling that way for a few weeks now. So the resonates with me. I know I just want to acknowledge too, being outside of the Minneapolis area, and I know if you're not in the Minneapolis area, this has been on the news and I think on people's minds outside of Minneapolis, but the Derek Chauvin trial is happening right now, and the jury went into deliberation last night. So that's been heavy on my mind, and I imagine on many of yours as well. So I just want to acknowledge that too. Not awake and or tired. Yep. Loved. Oh, I love that. I love that folks feel loved. That's great. Joyful. Good, beautiful day. Comfortable, curious, content, engaging, inquisitive. This is all great. Thank you. And Lindsay, yeah, Erin and Lindsay, thank you for in the chat. Yes, I'm happy to be here. Life, of course, continues to go on. A lot of my job has been making space for a lot of other folks at work this week. So that's kind of why I've been pouring my energy through all of this.
So if I can just interject, I mean, we see what goes on over the television,
Mhm.
and it seems pretty intense as it is.
Yep.
And I know that I think the last number I heard was 3,000 National Guard deployed across the state there. So, you know, whatever it seems like to us here,
Yep.
it's got to be 10 times that or more there, whether you're in Minneapolis or not.
Yes.
How
Yes.
is that?
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, thank you, Aaron. It's a lot. I actually live about 30 minutes from the city, so it's pretty quiet where I am. But a lot of my friends and colleagues are in the city, and it's a lot of police presence, a lot of military presence. So quite a lot.
Well,
Okay.
I hope everything goes well, because there's a good potential for it not. And
Yes.
yeah, so stay
Yes.
safe.
Thank you.
I
Thank you
hang
so
out in the
much.
RV too.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So yeah, a lot of different feelings for how everyone's feeling. So just want to acknowledge and give space for that. Hopefully you're able to kind of take a breath and walk away from whatever else is going on. I realize that's not always totally possible. But we have a lot of good content today, so we'll work through it. It's on a topic that I don't want to scare you all with it. Managing risk can sometimes be intimidating. So I'd like you to go back to Menti and just share, how does thinking about risk management make you feel? Are you in the category of blissful ignorance? It's not something you like to think about and you like it that way. So thinking about risk management at work or in your programming. Anxiety attack. Are you up at all hours of the night thinking about gaps in your policies and procedures? I definitely have colleagues who are like that. Cool cucumber. You acknowledge there may be some problems, but you try not to worry about them. Maybe some of them are largely out of your hands. Control freak, on the other hand, do you proactively assess and address every potential risk, no matter how remote? I feel like I waver in all four of those sometimes, and I have colleagues who definitely represent all of those categories. So lots of cool cucumbers. That's awesome. That doesn't surprise me, hearing from people who work in recovery communities. A lot of times you've kind of figured out what tools you need to develop that sort of balance. That's awesome. All right, perfect. And no control freaks yet, at least that anyone's had a chance to own up to. Just fine. It takes all kinds, right? All right. And then when you think about your volunteer programs or the ways that you work with your communities, thinking about your programming, how well would you say that you manage risk in your volunteer program? Blue ribbon, you got everything pretty much covered. Second place, pretty good, pretty solid, but still needs a little work. Or participation trophy. Hey, I showed up. Do I get a participation trophy? All right. So yeah, quite a lot of second place. That doesn't surprise me. That's usually how people share. And it also reflects a growth mindset that sometimes even when people pretty much have everything covered, sometimes folks who are curious about continuous improvement will always feel like they're in second place, right? Okay, so we're going to do an activity. We're not at tables. I won't kick you out into break rooms quite yet. But I'd like you to share, what are some risks that come to mind for you in working with communities or working with volunteer programs? Are there any activities that are performed by volunteers or community members in your organization that may be potentially risky? Volunteer lost. So is that, if someone wants to come off mute, if I'm not representing this correctly, is that someone who leaves volunteering, or did you mean something else? Okay, I'm going to assume that means
that's
that the
what I
volunteer
mean.
left.
That's what I mean by leaving, if they, losing volunteers.
Awesome, perfect. Yes, that's a great one. Working with vulnerable people, lack of HIPAA knowledge. Yes, yes, yes. Community members that don't clearly understand the scope of service being provided. from the chat, working with the children we have for Teen Thrive. Yep. Fallout from return to use, mental and emotional triggers, people losing interest, unprofessional behavior, confidentiality, creating chaos in the office, being on their cell phones. Awesome. Mental health from the chat, physical harm, HIPAA, poor recovery coaching, not in my backyard, NIMBY, confidentiality. Awesome. Thank you all for
I
sharing.
don't
Not knowing
understand not in my
boundaries.
backyard. I never heard that before. What's
Oh yeah,
that?
so that's a really good question. Thanks for coming off chat. Would whoever shared that like to characterize so I don't have to put words in your mouth? You can come off chat if you'd like to share. The person who said physical harm, HIPAA, poor recovery coaching, and NIMBY.
I didn't put that in the chat, but I can definitely attest to the physical harm. And the other person who said they didn't understand not in my backyard. The population that I serve does, they do live with mental health issues as well as substance abuse issues. And I've been assaulted myself, especially when they choose not to follow, excuse me, not only the HIPAA rules, but the rules of the community in which they are coming into themselves. They want to come in with substances. They want to come in with alcohol. They want to come in intoxicated or inebriated or whatever else, and it triggers the other members who are within the facility. I'm not familiar with NIMBY, but the poor recovery and coaching comes in my instance, as more of a self-defense mechanism, because we know that we're supposed to be able to talk to our communities. We're supposed to be able to associate and to bring things down to a minimum. But however, you are human. And at this particular time that I was being assaulted, the human came out of me and not the peer support person. I wanted to attack that person back. And as my supervisor was telling me I am antagonizing the situation, I had to pull myself out and realize what I was doing. As far as the not in our neighborhood, the stigma that's attached to mental health, period. You see people walking around talking to themselves. You see people who are severely going through their symptoms to where they're like overwhelming out there, and it looks dangerous. It looks crazy, for lack of a better phrase. And in the appearance, they don't realize that these people are coming to these places because they're trying to get better. They're trying to find different coping skills. They're trying to live a better quality of life. However, in some instances, the whatever mental health issues they are suffering through or substance abuse issues they are suffering through, these are the symptoms as a result. So the community that the outside community only sees what they see. They don't what they say. They see the cover of the book. They don't understand the inside story. So not inside my neighborhood. I don't want them people coming in here. They're talking to themselves. They might break into my house. They might talk to my child. They might. So that is the thing. Which is why a lot of those recovery homes are masked. When I was in California, I worked in a recovery home that looked like a regular house. It actually looked like the Brady Bunch house. And there were people with developmental disabilities there. There were people with mental health issues there. There were people with substance abuse issues there. But the community at large, unless they came back to back, did not know what was actually happening within that facility. So that's my opinion. I hope I didn't talk too long. And
no, thank you. Thank you, Drea. Yeah, thank you so much, Drea. So yeah, and in the chat too, building on what you shared from Nicole, NIMBY is like a community that doesn't want treatment centers in their town or whatnot. So echoing what Drea shared. Timothy, doesn't NIMBY have extreme negative and racist connotations? Absolutely. I think anytime you have a community that you know, isn't, for whatever reason, isn't welcome in the community, or saying, you know, don't bring it into where I live. Absolutely. Nicole shared, I personally wouldn't say it's racist, but it can be like a negative judgment against people with substance use disorder. So yeah, I think it can have racist undertones, or more overt, explicit racist overtones. And sometimes it has other things at play, like stigma against folks who are, you know, experiencing homelessness, folks who are experiencing substance use disorders, and in recovery, folks who may have you know, be living with mental illness as well, and a number of things. So yeah, that's great. Thank you. Moving through the rest of them: confidentiality, interpersonal drama, not knowing boundaries, relapse, short-term participation, lack of formal process, low level of commitment from volunteers, turnover rate, underdeveloped leadership skills of the organization, and an acknowledgement, I need more training and experience myself. Those are all really great. Thank you. So thank you all for sharing on Menti and in the chat and off mute. I think we can all agree that every organization has its risks, right? And there are myriad risks for working with communities and working with volunteers or community members. So I hope we can all agree that it is an area of concern for all of us. And no matter what your organization's level of risk, because it is going to change based on the communities you're working with and within, it's going to change based on just the types of programming and services you provide. Everyone does have some sort of risk. So basically, no matter what your organization's level of risk, no matter what your personal inclination for dealing with it, whether you're the control freak, the cool cucumber, the ignorance is bliss, it's basically important that you establish a program for managing those risks. And part of managing it is just calling out that they exist, right? So ignorance is bliss. I don't know if anyone shared that one. Of course, it's not the best idea. Because identifying your organization's risks is the first step in empowering you to prevent them from happening. Some folks ask, well, can we just get insurance? Insurance, it may protect us in the case that we get sued, or there's a lawsuit, but it can't undo some of the other risks that come, like getting an insurance, you know, umbrella policy or what have you. Won't do anything to undo bad publicity, lost faith from your community members or supporters, the time that goes into defending a claim, and all the losses that aren't covered by insurance, as well as any risk that comes in just doing harm to people. We don't want to do harm to people, and insurance isn't going to fix that. For any of you for whom anxiety may be keeping you up at night for you know, doing what you can to protect against all these variables and all these risks, of course, remember that we can never be perfect. So go easy on yourselves. We can't totally eliminate the potential of human error in our programs, or the idea that someone might come in with intention to do harm. It might happen, or someone just screws up. That happens, right? But we can emphasize managing those inherent risks, and then we reduce the chances of accidents or errors that are aimed at or caused by our volunteers or community members. So again, this is about managing risk, not controlling it and not eliminating it. So the key that we'll talk through is that you need to weigh the extent of the risk. So how risky is this thing? What's the likelihood it's going to happen? How important is the activity that you're doing? And then where do you have opportunities to build in better risk management procedures? So what we are hoping to cover with you today, in short, basically today, I want you to walk away with all of these three things, and the four on the screen as well. But in a nutshell, a feeling like you've developed and are adhering, a feeling that developing and adhering a risk management program is actually important. You might already be there, but that's kind of key one. I'd like you to walk away feeling like the topic today is important. I also want you to walk away with tips on how to implement a program for managing risk. And finally, I want you to feel empowered to actually do this. I don't want you to feel anxious, like, oh, the universe of everything is so big and I just don't even know what to do to develop this program. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. And I don't want you to walk away feeling ambivalent, like, oh, it's out of my control, I'm not going to worry about it. In addition to that, so we'll talk about importance of managing risk, like I said. We'll talk about the importance of policies and procedures. We'll talk about a process for evaluating risks and preventive strategies. And then, so worst case scenario, just a little bit on how you can handle a liability incident or an emergency situation if it arises in your organization. So let's see how we are for time. Running behind, I'm always running behind, always running behind. So I'm gonna start zooming here. First concept is that preventive risk is essential for all organizations serving the community. Hopefully we're all on that same page. So if you're thinking about, basically, if you're thinking about what you're going to do to develop your program, think about what is at risk. So we already talked about some of that in our brainstorm. Why do we need a system? And then actually like defining what is risk management. So for that, I'd like you to go back to Menti. And there are no wrong answers. I mean, there might be less great answers than others, but no wrong answers. You're not going to get in trouble for spitballing here. How would you define risk management? So again, that's at Menti. Thank you, Wendy, for always being in the chat with the codes. All right, answers already coming in. Understanding and mitigating risk factors for the organization. Awesome. Being prepared for conflict or issues. How to deal with a difficult situation that arrives, looking at the problem at hand and finding solutions. Being aware of potential risks and having an action plan to address or minimize them. Having a plan of action when problems arise, preconceived ideas of how to handle a situation, listening really well and objectively. Yeah, that's key. Being aware of problems, forward thinking, policies and procedures to prepare for any issues that may arise, thinking about possible risks and planning to mitigate and control for them, defining what risks are that may possibly affect your organization and coming up with mitigation strategies. Oopsie. Being aware of activities that could jeopardize the wellness and safety for participants in the organization, foresight to problems and proactive steps to identify and mitigate, handling problems and doing preventive maintenance. Yes, all awesome, thank you. So no wrong answers in there, those were all wonderful. Risk management for the purpose of this slide and training, the definition that they've chosen or we've chosen is a system to forecast risks in advance and take proactive steps to deal with identified risks. So I think you were all right on the money. Thank you. So steps again in managing risk are to, so again, identify what are your risks, just name them, what might go wrong. Think through all of that. And we did an example of that earlier. You could certainly go back to your organizations and do that with colleagues as well. Evaluate the risk. So in other words, how likely is it to occur? And what's the amount of potential harm? So even some risks might be really likely to occur, but the harm might be pretty minimal. So it may not be something that you stress about too much or that requires too many mitigation strategies. Finally, what can you do to control the risk? You can't completely control it, right? But how can you basically look at your evaluation of the risks? So what are they? How risky is it, or what's the potential it'll do harm? And based on your evaluation, a few things that you might do to try to control or mitigate it include stopping or delaying an activity until it's safe. That's something, especially under COVID, a lot of that I think happened in our communities and in our world, where because we didn't understand the virus, we didn't understand, you know, how to treat it exactly. A lot of things shut down, right? So schools shut down, you know, businesses shut down, stay home. That would be kind of an extreme example of stopping or delaying an activity till it's safe. Second, eliminating or diminishing a risk by changing the way, in this case, volunteers or community members are screened, trained, and supervised. So you might be able to control the risk to some extent just by making a few adjustments in the programming and how you manage things. Minimize harm. So that can be if you've decided an activity is too important to stop or delay, and you've done everything you can possibly do to diminish the risk. So through training or supervision or screening or what have you. So you've done those, you've looked through those things and the risk is still there. that's when you might look at minimizing the harm associated with it. And I think you're all probably really, I'm going to assume you're all pretty familiar with harm reduction strategies. That's basically what this is doing, but with programming. So can you think about how you minimize harm if the bad thing happens? How can you minimize the harm that results from it? And that's when you might look at developing procedures to handle a disaster, emergency, or crisis. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, you can technically transfer the liability. That might come in the form of an insurance policy, asking volunteers or participants to sign a waiver, etc. So that isn't perfect. It's not going to be the catch-all, but it can be kind of like a, we've done everything we can possibly do. This will just give us a little more feeling like we're not going to be assigned as much liability. So back to, let's see. So, we went through all of this. Let's see. So in addition to that, did I cover all of this for strategies for approaching risk? So there are obviously some organizations may refuse, like I said, to do an activity if it carries risk. So you're going to run into that. Risk mitigation is where, again, we're looking at how do we actually do something differently to keep the risk from happening. Transferring, again, that's insurance. And sometimes risk is just worth it. So that's just, the activity that we're doing is too important. There's no way that we can absolutely control for it or prevent it from happening, but this thing is really important to do. So we're going to do it, but as much as possible, here are the guardrails or parameters we're going to put around the activity. Or this is where, we're just going to tell folks so I think one of you shared, I think Drea, you shared being assaulted coming into work or going into programming. That might be something where you just tell the folks who are involved, like these are all the things we've done to try to protect you and protect the community and protect everyone involved, but this risk still exists. So we want you to be fully informed of it so that you're coming into it with full knowledge of what that means for you. So gonna go back to Menti again. Given everything that we just discussed, why do you think we should have systems to manage risk? So you can be prepared if the risk arises, help reduce harm to yourself and others. Forewarned is forearmed, awesome. To prepare for the best and the worst. In a community, a system to manage risk provides safety for all. Process, accountability, evaluation, and preparation. Liability, to be clear what is expected. Awesome. To define actions when risk arises, to reduce unnecessary risk or harm and prepare for potential risk factors, protection of agency, staff, clients, and community members. These are all great. We're going to keep moving here. Thank you all for sharing all that. Sounds like we're all pretty much on the same page. So again, why is it important to have a system? So basically, we're looking at 3 different buckets of liability to ourselves, our programs, our organizations, our communities. First is the liability of the individual volunteer. So a volunteer or community member who's coming in, their own criminal behavior or breach of obligation could put us at risk. There's also liabilities of the agency to the volunteer or community member. So that could mean that our agency hasn't protected them from harm, or from something like discrimination, injury on the job, and so on. Then there's also liabilities to the organization due to the actions of volunteers. So this would be an action by the volunteer within or outside of the scope of what we're asking them to do in their duties. It could be failure in using proper care in selecting, screening, training, supervising volunteers. So that's kind of generally where you might run into problems, and any of those could impact your organization. So then let's talk about what's at risk. So I'm going to ask you to go back to Menti again. What's at risk if we don't worry about this stuff, if we don't come up with programming, policies, risk mitigation strategies? What's the risk? What's the risk to us or to our communities, our organizations, our volunteers? What could happen? Our reputation. Yep, reputation of the organization, people's lives. Undercurrent of anxiety, literally everything. Negatively affecting those we serve. Program funding, not only the organization, but the well-being of those we serve. Not having boundaries and structures can lead to chaos. Reputation, harm, stress, safety, the communities we serve, our orgs, everything else. Everyone's well-being, everyone's recovery path, bad reputation of the agency, loss of trust, ability to operate the business. Yes, these are all great. Thank you. I think, again, smart group, all on the same page here. So what's at risk? Like basically kind of everything. But if we're to break it down, the people, like everyone involved, all of you, the people who work for the organization, people who volunteer, clients and community members you serve, your actual property, ability to bring in income. So someone mentioned funding, and or like if you're having to defend a claim against you, that gets expensive. Goodwill of the organization or for the organization. So your reputation we talked about, your mission. So just like absolutely your ability to carry out on your mission or to actually do what you're here to do. All of those things are potentially at risk if we don't come up with these strategies. So how are we going to come up with the strategies? What are we going to do about it? So we've made the case for why risk management is important. So we'll look at how to actually execute it effectively. So this concept is going to cover the idea that all staff and volunteers need to be familiar with and follow established agency policies and procedures for risk management. Because thinking thinking through all of this isn't enough. We can navel gaze about risk forever and ever and ever, but until it's actually put into action and importantly, people actually know about it, it's not actually going to help us much. So that's kind of how, part of the battle is figuring out what your risks are. Second part is figuring out what you're going to do about it. And then the third part, which people sometimes forget about, is making sure people actually know what they're supposed to do. The communication piece is so important. Oops. Okay, so I'd like you to go back to Menti again. What are some ways that you are managing risk in your programs at your organizations? What are some things you're already doing? So I'll bet you're doing something, probably a lot of somethings. Training, clear communication. Guidelines, contracts, rules, background checks, references. Observation, teamwork, questions, interviews, listening, watching, doing little. Lots of, let's see, teamwork. Great. Communication is really big. Policies, learning by osmosis, weekly supervision meetings. Awesome, thank you. It's getting to the point that I'm like, I can't follow all the word clouds, so hopefully you're seeing all the new ones come up. Procedures, excellent. Thank you all. And now that we've talked about, so this is an activity, if we were in person, I make everyone write their love note to policies and procedures on a Post-it and put it on the wall, and then we read them all. We can't do that here. So I'm going to ask you essentially to do that in Menti. So why do you love policies and procedures to manage risk? What makes you feel good about risk management? I just want to acknowledge it can be sometimes a scary and intimidating topic. It can feel like you're asked to come up with everything that may potentially be out of your control and try to control it, right? Which, that's a hard thing to do because you can't control everything, right? So let's get into a position of empowerment about risk management rather than anxiety or apathy. Why do you love policies and procedures to manage risk? Someone shared board meetings, individually, consistency, pressure, less. Everyone's on the same page, forethought, can't argue with it, shows there's a plan, judgment, knowledge, consistency, prepares you, supports the org, provides fairness for all, that is key, gives some structure, security, good for working conditions, feeling safe and prepared. This is all great. To be less pressure individually, Erin, thank you in the chat. That makes sense. I was like, do you love it less now? Consistency is coming up a lot. Awesome. Well, risk management appreciates all your love notes. I keep in contact with risk management frequently, and she appreciates all the appreciation. So what will policies do for us? So I think you already covered a lot of this stuff. But in summary, policies are great for us because they establish a standard for behavior and kind of a common body of knowledge that everyone, more or less should abide by, right? They support necessary requirements. So like, for example, if you have a one-on-one mentorship program that requires a background check, having a policy would support that that's when you do it and for whom. They provide valuable orientation and training. So just having people read and update themselves on the policies, providing training to policies, it's an important part of your overall orientation and training with folks. They help ensure operational consistency. That came up a lot in our word cloud. And finally, if the worst thing happens and we're sued, or we have some sort of criminal case against us, policies will strengthen our organization's case by showing that we displayed diligence in trying to prevent the issue. So that's kind of like the worst case, why policies are helpful. So this screen has just a sampling of some policies and procedures that are pretty common for community organizations that work with volunteers. However, every organization is going to differ on what policies are necessary. So this is where we can talk about, we can share best practice. This is what we think best practice is. However, best practice is set by someone who, has a certain view on the world that's not always objective. And so this is where you really need to look at what's important to you and your organization. What are the unique risks that you have within your organization, and developing policies accordingly. So while it's helpful to understand what policies organizations like yours may be using, sometimes that can be a little bit overwhelming. So if you went out to 100 different organizations and said, send me your handbooks and all of your policies that have to do with volunteers, you're probably going to get a lot of different answers, because everyone does, the nature of work is different at different organizations. The size of your program is going to make a difference. If you're a really small program, you may not need as many or as robust of policies as an organization that's much bigger and that maybe has the staffing and capacity to even develop them. The risk level of your client demographic can really inform what kinds of policies and procedures you need. So especially like organizations that are working with vulnerable communities or working with minors may be more likely to need more robust policies than, I don't mean to pick on animal rescues, but I'm always thinking like, the risk in working with cats, they exist, but it's a little different than working with, like, say, children, right? So that's it. Basically, what's your client demographic? How old is your program too? You can't really expect a program that's brand new and just getting off the ground to have as many policies and procedures as perhaps an organization that's been around for 100 years, has seen everything, and as such has developed a policy and procedure to deal with kind of the universe of everything that's been thrown at them. So just a few things to level set so you don't feel overwhelmed as you're walking into this. So on this slide are just a few examples of policies and procedures some programs have adopted. So screening policies for your volunteers, suspension and dismissal of volunteers, required training, confidentiality, working conditions, financial and operations controls, emergency procedures, and one that when I first started doing this training, social media procedures was a new concept. At this point, it's probably no longer a new concept, but this is just around, do you have any parameters for how people interact with social media while on organization time or speaking out on behalf of the organization? So that's, yeah, so that's about it. Can folks, do you need a procedure or a policy to say that, for example, volunteers can't post pictures on social media while they're in the organization or while they're doing work on your behalf? So just some things to think through that other organizations typically do. Some additional tips on the MAVA members only section. I'm not sure, I think if you're not a member, you may not be able to access that, but if you can't access that, and I can say MAVA membership is awesome if you want to have access to stuff like this, as well as like ongoing learning and training and communities to discuss a lot of volunteer management practices. But if you Google it, of course, Dr. Google always has a lot of good stuff out there, right? Another thing you can do if you're developing policies kind of from scratch, like I mentioned, contact an organization like yours, ideally one that has a similar focus, and ask if they would share their policies. Like I said, search the internet, see what others have done. And finally, be mindful of racial equity when approaching policymaking. So if you're familiar with applying an equity lens to a decision or a policy, basically think through how would the proposed policies adversely affect a particular group of people, or like who's at the table for making the decision? Are the communities that would be impacted actually there to help inform the decision making along the way? So be really aware of all of that as well. Wendy, thank you in the chat. Wendy put a link in there with more information about becoming a MAVA member. Thank you. So third concept is understanding risk. So we've gone through, hopefully you understand why it's important to have a risk management program. We've covered how some organizations have made procedures. So now we'll review some strategies for actually getting them rolled out. So like I said, you're not all the way there if you're making the policies but not telling anyone about them. So all staff and volunteers need to understand the potential risks that are unique to the organization, and then know and be continuously trained and reinforced on preventive strategies, whether it's job design, screening, training, supervision, that you can use to address and minimize these risks. So really a lot of the other modules in this training series, you can kind of consider it all a part of your risk management program, just like all of the things that you learn will also be ways to engage and recruit and keep and retain your volunteers. A lot of this too, a lot of the same concepts you're learning are going to help manage risk for your organization. So one thing that you can do, because you want to assess risk and figure out how to respond to it. So just like I mentioned, the level and type of risk may vary from agency to agency, depending on the size of your organization, the client base you serve. It can also vary from position to position within your organization. So you may have volunteers or community members working in very risky areas, and you may have folks who are working in very, very low risk areas. So that can be a really useful exercise to try to segment those out, so you can apply different risk management strategies with each of them. So here we'll talk about assigning kind of a low to mid-level risk versus a high risk and talk through that. Back in my volunteer program, I assigned them tiers. So basically like tier 1 was high risk, 2 was kind of medium risk, 3 was low risk, based on the type of work that volunteers performed. And that helped inform how the volunteers would be screened, how they would be trained, how they would be supervised, where the work is to occur, with what type of client, if any. So going through here, some examples of low to mid-level risk. would include those who are working like just in the office with non-confidential information, work that's done during office hours with pretty close supervision from staff or another senior volunteer. Low to mid-level might be group-based sessions with adult volunteers and with staff supervision. That's kind of critical in public places. Project-based work from home or the office with some supervision. Some of the things that I deemed as low risk in my organization, really anything that was one-time or short-term, done off-site, done with really consistent staff supervision with low sensitivity information, and never with clients or program participants, and never in a place where the person would be representing us to the public unless they were using a really scripted conversation. So examples would be like door-to-door canvassers when we would do election work, event participants like coat check, that sort of stuff, or tablers if there's someone who's doing outreach but there's a staff person with them. Phone bankers, we do a lot of, since we do electoral work, folks who are actually just calling on the phone using a script. That's pretty low risk by our definition. And then if we look at high level risk, there are obviously examples of potentially higher risk volunteer positions. I'll bet you work with a lot of them. So some of the examples that they give here are unsupervised mentoring between a volunteer and a vulnerable client, health or personal care given in a client's home by individual volunteers. Anytime you have folks working in hazardous or dangerous situations, anyone working with money, financial data, or confidential information. And that's generally the way we followed it too at my work. If someone was working with patients or minors, we would consider that high risk. If they were working with sensitive, privy, confidential type information or anything to do with like cash handling or any access to financial information, we would consider all of those high risk. Or really anyone who is going to be in the office and potentially doing work that potentially might be unsupervised. So like if we had a phone bank, we'd have 20 people come in, do the same thing, use the same script, and we'd have a supervisor kind of walking through. On the other hand, if we had a volunteer who came in every week, went to their own cubicle, did their project, and their supervisor was on the other side of the building and only checked in once a day, we might consider that a little bit higher risk. So once your risk factors are identified in your volunteer position, so when you're doing your job description design, that's kind of when to start thinking through that. That's when you can start building in your preventive strategies and then write them into your position description so everyone's on the same page. How is this person screened? How do they get orientation and training? And how are they going to be supervised? So that again is the communication piece of making sure that everyone understands what's expected of everyone. So we'll discuss some of those preventive strategies in a little more detail. Written position descriptions, like I mentioned, position descriptions are addressed elsewhere in this series, but just want to again underscore how essential they are to a successful risk management program. They basically help ensure that the person who's doing the volunteer position is actually qualified to do so. And really critically, they help establish a scope for that position. So what can you and can't you do as a volunteer in this position? And then that feeds into performance management. So if someone starts working outside of their scope, so like if I've trained someone, for example, we have volunteers who escort patients since we have protesters. So we have volunteers who stand outside in smocks and are just there to act as a buffer between patients and these picketers and to help them safely get to the front door and feel like they're welcome and taken care of. These folks don't have training and are not supposed to provide counseling or really talk to the patient aside from small talk. And that's written into the position description because we have professionals who can actually like talk through the medical visit, talk through any sort of like counseling piece, and we don't train the escorts to do that, and they may not have the skills to do it. So that's where we've had to use that position description sometimes because well-meaning volunteers may say, oh, well, this person came outside and had questions or seemed upset, so I sat down and talked to them. Like, yeah, we understand you want to do that because you want to be helpful, but we have trained people who for whom that is their job or it's scoped into their role. And so what we need you to do is stay within the scope of your position description. And if it starts to come outside of that, this is where you take this person or this is where you go from there. So again, they establish expectations. The position descriptions focus on qualifications. Like I said, you can use that as your tool to assess the risks and choose the proper level of screening. Job descriptions provide documentation when needed, like I mentioned, to show that a volunteer acted outside their duties. And they kind of establish limitations and barriers that may prevent individuals who may wish to do you harm in coming into your organization in the first place. For example, you might establish the maximum time someone can spend with a client or supervision requirements. So of course, we don't want to assume that folks are coming into the organization to do us harm, but like say you have a program working with minors and there's someone who wants to come volunteer with you because they want to access minors. If you have right in that job description that this is the actual contact you're going to have with folks, you're going to be carefully supervised, you'll never be alone with anyone, that can like really, really worst case scenario, perhaps turn that person off. So I will pause here for questions, and then I would like to go out into breakout rooms. So Wendy, if you could, let's see, how many people are here today?
About 20, it would be about 21.
21, okay. I'm thinking maybe, could we do groups of maybe 7 groups of 3 for this? So I'll pause here for questions, and then, so don't send us out yet, Wendy. I'll just pause here and then I'll tell you what we're going to be doing for this activity. So I know I've just really information dumped on all of you and talked a whole lot. So want to pause here. Do you have any questions on anything we've covered so far? And you can come off mute or go into the chat.
This is Gab, at MRC, Minnesota Recovery Connection. Social media policies, procedures. I'm curious, what has that looked like for other organizations? What have they put into play? What does that look like now? Because I honestly hadn't really thought about it in the greater context.
Right. Well, that's a really good question. I will answer that for my organization. And then if others want to jump in with any other perspectives, please do so. So with my organization, generally, so we don't, we do have, I think, a little bit of a social media policy just around like not spending the whole time you're volunteering, like scrolling Instagram or Facebook. Like I guess that's more about good use of your time, right? The other, I guess, the more critical piece is confidentiality. So it's not just unique to social media. It kind of covers everything that we talk about within our confidentiality policies around what you can and can't share outside of your work or your volunteer position. So it really comes kind of more into play there. And then also we basically have a line in the handbook that says that you can't represent our organization publicly without, you can't go out there and say, here's my opinion as a representative of this organization. That you can say whatever you want on social media as long as it doesn't compromise confidentiality. And as long as it doesn't appear that your opinion is as the representative of, in this case, Planned Parenthood. And that's where we also have separate media policies too, that only certain people can be representatives of the organization and say that they are. So it's usually our CEO, our media relations director, or anyone they delegate to. So you would need to be delegated to in order to do that. So that's kind of how we've tackled it. How about any others? Carolyn's also looking for the handouts.
I got the manual and the link, but that was just that. I'm not sure where they are.
So Cindy, Chris, Wendy,
yeah, we'll get those. I'll put them here in the file in the chat. Carolyn, are you able to download them from there?
Yeah, I think so. Or I can cut and paste if it's a link or something.
Yeah. I'll put both the link to our dedicated webpage, and then I'll It'll take me a moment, but I'll get them in there ASAP.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you.
And
All
Nikki,
right.
there's a request for a break if possible.
Oh, yes. Good call. Yes, absolutely. So why don't we do, before we go into breakout, why don't we just do, are there any questions first, and then we'll take a quick break? Okay. Well, hold your questions. We'll still have more time. So why don't we take, is a 5-minute break enough time for folks? 7, 10? 10? Folks are feeling 10. I can make that work. So let's do a 10-minute break, come back at 10 minutes past the hour, and then we'll put you, I'll give you an instruction for your activity and we'll go into breakout rooms. How's that sound?
Perfect. My dog's whining at me. He needs to go
No.
out.
Yes, I get it. Yes, thank you. So I'll see you all in 10 minutes.
And then Carolyn, Cindy put a link to the webpage, and I'm gonna just drop that session 3 handouts into the file in the chat where you can download them.
Yeah, I found it. I didn't realize that it was,
Oh.
I should check. I'm sorry, I just would scroll down, but I didn't scroll down far enough. So
Oh,
thank
no
you.
worries, no worries,
Sorry about that.
no worries. I put it in there anyway, just for anybody who needs it.
This is Nikki. I'm going to take the opportunity to step away, and when I'm back, I will put my video on in case anyone has any questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Nikki.
Mhm. Okay, I've got 10 past, so hopefully folks are coming back. If you could flash me your video quickly so I know you're back, that would be helpful, even if you can't stay. I love, Cynthia, I love the hand wave. I see you there. Awesome. Looks like I'm seeing folks. Oh, I love all the waving and the smiles. It's so great. Okay, everyone, welcome back. So before we go into breakout rooms, I put the instructions in the chat. They're on the screen share here as well. But what I would like you to do is take out your handouts, look for attachment A, which is way in the back. And this is going to be a job description. So we've talked through how position descriptions are a good place to look at how a volunteer role is scoped, how are they supervised, how are they trained, how are they screened, what are going to be their responsibilities, and that this is a really good tool for risk management. So what I would like you to do as a group is read that job description and then circle the places that the position description is already addressing risk management. So where are some of these things already built in? And then have a quick discussion around how the position description could be made even stronger to better manage risk. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes because we're a little short on time. So if we could set it for 10 minutes in the small groups. If you have any questions, we'll be here if you want to come in on the chat, if you need anything. Otherwise, again, circle the places where it's managing risk and then discuss how it could be made even better. And then I'm going to ask you, we'll be back in Menti. So if you could kind of take notes mentally or actually take notes, I'm going to ask you to share what some of those improvements could have been. So any questions before we throw you out into your rooms? Cool. Well, then Wendy, take it away.
Hi there. Hi, sorry, we were a bit confused as to where attachment A is.
Sure. Do you have the handouts?
Yes, it's
Okay.
15 pages, right? That's today's?
Yep. Do you
Okay.
have page 15, attachment A? It would be, it's way in the back. So you've got a whole bunch of handout, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh my
And then-
gosh, yes.
And then
I
it's
saw
the,
all the like resources, and so I thought that was just the end. I didn't think it would be here. I'm sorry. Thank you.
yeah.
Okay, are you able to put us back in a breakout? Okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, of course. Wendy, are you on that? Looks like yes. Thank you so much. Okay, as folks are coming back, it looks like some of the groups are probably still wrapping up conversations, so it'll be about 30 seconds still. But what I'd like you to do while we're waiting is go back to Menti. And from your discussions, what would you have changed or added? And you can start populating stuff. I'll also ask that folks can come off mute if they want to share, but let's wait for the whole group to be back first. Thank you again, Wendy.
All right, everybody should be back.
Okay, everyone's back. Awesome. Thank you so much, Wendy. Welcome back, everyone. So based on your conversations, I'd like you to go to Menti, and you can either share there, what would you have added or changed about this job description? You can share in Menti, or if you prefer, do it in the chat or come off mute and share.
Can I come off mute and share?
Yes, please do, Erin.
So I jumped into my breakout room kind of late. My dog decided he didn't like a skateboarder. Anyways, and my group just let me jump right in, which was awesome. I think that in a job description, there has to be provisions for it being open. As far as job duties, I think that a lot of volunteers, especially what I see coming to my center, they come in thinking they want one thing and then finding a passion for something else. So leaving something open in a job description I think is important. Anyways, that's my 2
Awesome.
cents. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Erin. Thank you. Yeah, that's great. So yeah, actually delineating, and this does just a little of that, in that it says like, we'll have an evaluation at the end to say, to check in on whether you want to keep doing this. But yeah, that's big. If there is opportunity for people to try new things, be sure to encompass that and include that in the job description.
Absolutely.
Yes, so thank you, Erin. And then got lots of stuff popping up in Menti. Objective and responsibilities were too vague and didn't give specific direction as to what the duties would be. It only provided a past example. So is the direction of the position up to the volunteer? Yep, great. More details. Be familiar with the recovery community. Yes, that would be super important, especially for areas that you all are working on. More specifics in the job description, mention of reviewing policies and procedures, an earlier evaluation. Yep. Check-ins available weekly or bi-weekly. Yep. Yeah, it doesn't really give much information about, it says who the supervisor is, but it looks like the supervisor doesn't really show up until it's all done at the end. So some sort of check-in. Add a clause for early termination for issues involving the volunteer. More and earlier evaluations coming up again. A code of conduct, more detail in training and preparation. Have a copy for the volunteer to be sure they understand the agreement. Yes, thank you. And then in the chat, confidentiality. Yes, thanks, Timothy. Anyone want to, you can come off mute if you'd like to share anything else that hasn't already come up, or again, use the chat or Menti. These are all great.
Hi, Nikki and everyone else. Just quickly, Timothy from Oklahoma City. Thank you. In our small group, we bounced around a lot of things, but lastly, one of the things we spoke about was like a grievance procedure. Like if there was anything on either end, like, I mean, usually, like I'll just speak for my own org and our RCO, like we'll have like a grievance procedure, and the Inspector General's information is within every intake, no matter participant or volunteer or anything like that. So having a slot or a provision for that procedure of filing a grievance if anything ever happened, and then of course, yeah, confidentiality.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much, Timothy. Yeah, anything that you can put in there around grievance process, or what are the rights, what are the rights of the volunteer? And you can either put that in the position description. Another thing you can do is some of this stuff you can also put into like a volunteer handbook. And so if some of it is consistent for all of your volunteers and not just dependent upon each individual job description, that's just another alternative of something you can do, is have some sort of volunteer handbook that covers all of that if it's universal for all the volunteers, and put in the job description that you need to read, review, and sign off on your handbook. So lots of different ways to go about that. Anything else? That was great. These were all really great examples. I think you pretty much caught the gist. So nice work, everyone. Anyone else want to share?
I'll go. I was also in a small group with Timothy and Christy, and we kind of talked a little bit more too about just maybe more information, like contact information from the supervisor, also references, because it looks like in the objective they would be working with people that the organization serves. So it would be nice to know how they work with people, and maybe a mission and vision, so that they have an idea of the company's mission and vision before they even apply or read the rest of the position description.
Yes, great. Those are all great examples. Thank you. Yeah, and yeah, I'm not getting much of a sense about what I see, what the organization's kind of topical area is, but what is their mission and vision? Also, what's the vision of the group or the project? Again, a lot of you talked about how more details are needed, but I'd be interested as a volunteer to be successful. I'd want to know, like, what's the impact? What are the deliverables you're looking for? What resources and support are you going to provide me on this kind of amorphous, vague project? So all of that would be super useful to add. Great examples. Anything else before we move on? Oh. All right. Well, I would usually give more space to keep chiming in, but we got a clip here. We've got a lot yet to cover in our short period of time here. So we've talked about how you can use position descriptions as a risk management strategy. I think you've all grasped that very well. So now we just want to discuss a little more about how you can use screening as another tool in your toolkit. So if your organization has high risk volunteer positions, such as unsupervised mentoring, anything, all the high risk things we talked about earlier, special training should be given to staff who will be interviewing them and screening and selecting these volunteers regarding the types of screening questions to ask, or how exactly to go about selecting your volunteers. You'll also want, a process for, are you doing background checks? Are you checking references? Whatever you decide through all of that, be sure that you use a structured procedure for screening to ensure consistency and to prevent arbitrary decisions from being made. This is also really important in ensuring equity across your processes, to make sure that, so not only because you need to do that, you could get in trouble if you're accused of discrimination, but also we all want to do the right thing and ensure that everyone has equal access to our opportunities. So if you have structured processes, structured procedures, like these people do background checks, these don't, these people do reference checks, these don't, these folks need an in-person interview, these folks don't, based on what the job descriptions are, then you can ensure that you have a fair and defensible method if anyone ever questions your decisions. Use a written position description for everyone. Use personal interviews, especially for higher risk positions. You may not, so we, like at my organization, we don't sit down and do an actual interview with every single person who comes in. Like if they want to come in and phone bank one time or show up to an event, maybe we don't need to do like a one-on-one interview, but for those higher risk, higher touch, longer, more involved position or internship experiences, it is helpful to do a personal interview so that you can learn about their motivation, share expectations both ways, make sure that it's actually going to be, most importantly, a good fit for the volunteer. Is it what they're actually looking for? If you have really high risk positions, multiple screening methods can help you. You can ask questions in different ways, written versus verbal. And that helps you just accommodate different communication styles and offers you more information. Also, it gives room to, it kind of makes a more inclusive process as well. Some people might be really good at an in-person verbal interview, terrible at answering, written questions. So, so think through whether or not that makes sense for you. And ask questions in different ways, verify information when it's warranted, and make sure you're gathering all of the data that you need before you make a final decision. Also, good to follow up with a volunteer if any clarification is needed. So for example, if you do background checks, if something pops up on someone's background check and you need a little bit more about the story to make a decision, because it's never black and white, it's super nuanced. How long ago was the offense? What was going on? What's happened since then? It's not just hopefully at least you're not using background checks as a strict yes or no, but you may need to get a little more information from someone if something comes up. Speaking of which, background checks. So basically they're appropriate for some positions, some opportunities, especially like in our case, anyone who's working with minors or with patients, especially without a lot of staff supervision, would get a background check. But not where I think some organizations run into problems is where they think they need to do a background check on absolutely every position. That may be the case for some organizations. In a lot, it's not. So that's where you might also want to think through, are these a barrier? Not only to those with a criminal record, no matter what the offense, but also to folks who just don't trust them, right? And so is it a barrier that you actually need in place? Also, carefully consider which positions require background checks and then which offenses would exclude a person from volunteering. And that's where, again, it's not always black and white. Stuff comes up that it may be relevant or not. As much as possible, if you can kind of have some guiding principles in place in advance, that can be helpful. So kind of the way that we approach it is, is it related to the job we're going to be having them do? If not, it's probably not important. For example, like a lot of folks have like DUI or driving offenses. If they're not going to be driving for us, we're not really concerned about that. Also, like the length, how long ago it happened. A lot can happen in folks' lives. So if it's been a long time since the offense was on their background check, we take that into consideration. Theft charges come up a lot. Are they going to be in a position with us where they could actually even have access to steal anything? If not, maybe that's not super important. And again, if it was a long time ago, a lot has happened and maybe we don't really care about that. Our kind of our non-negotiable, just given that we're, a healthcare provider and what we do, the non-negotiables that we've come up against have mostly been around like actual like physical assault. That's where it starts to get a little more like, we kind of lean more in the area, more on the side of maybe we don't like, maybe we're going to screen this person out based on that. Again, not black and white, but that's kind of where we tend to be more, adhere a little more to caution around that. We also, as we receive grants from the federal government, and so we also need to check, because if someone is actually disbarred disbarred from working in any organization that's federally funded, that's where we run into problems as well, where it might even be out of our hands, and it's like you're showing up on a list because of some sort of issue that's come up that the government basically is saying you can't work for anyone that's receiving federal funds. So that's one thing that sometimes we don't have as much control over. So most important thing beyond that, make sure that you actually need it for the position. Make sure, again, you understand what you're going to do with the results. Cost is obviously a burden to some organizations, so that is a consideration. And most importantly, it's only one component of a screening process. So make sure that the background check's actually going to give you useful information that you can actually do something with. An example I can give you of that is at some point, so Planned Parenthood often is, under attack from our opposition. We've had video stings and people trying to infiltrate the organization to try to get intel on us or get potentially like harmful information to our reputation. And so we have to be pretty careful about who we invite and what access we give to the organization. And a few years ago, when we were coming up against a big opposition sting, knee-jerk response from some in our leadership was, well, we have to do a criminal background check on everyone who comes in, and that will keep us safe. And it's like, no, a lot of the folks who were looking to infiltrate us, the stuff that they do doesn't show up on a background check, right? So if you oppose Planned Parenthood, for example, probably not going to show up on a background check. Maybe, but that's where the screening that we really needed to do was more around, you know, are they showing up on our opposition lists? Have we seen them at our events? Are they able to show that they are who they say they are? And then more importantly, like, how are we supervising them? Like, are we going to let them go off on their own with a video camera and videotape things, or go into our files and steal things? Like, no, we're going to be supervising them. So take that into consideration as well. And finally, like I said, to consider equity as well. If you are requiring background checks of everyone, I think just an acknowledgement that people are disproportionately affected by the justice system. And a lot of folks, especially white folks, are more likely, because of the way our systems are structured, or they're less likely to have a criminal record than a lot of other communities. So if you're trying to consider equity and access to being involved in your organizations, that's really important as well, and to factor that into your decision making. So good idea here, like I mentioned. Even if you do require background checks for some of your positions, are there some positions that wouldn't require one? And it's good to try to have at least a few entry points to your organization for folks. So if they do have a criminal background, or they don't want to do a background check, they can still, volunteering is still accessible to them. For those positions, you might use other risk management strategies. So maybe they have really direct supervision. They're not working with really vulnerable communities or really confidential information, or whatever is the reason that you're doing background checks for some positions. Try to have some where there's an entry point to the organization for folks who, for whatever reason, don't want to do a background check or may not pass one. Let's see, what else? Other important risk mitigation strategies include orientation, supervision, and evaluation. We talked a little bit about that in delineating it all in the job description. And all of this stuff is going to show up in other parts of this series, so we won't go into a super ton into depth here. But just an emphasis that a lot of these things that are practices and good things to do, because they're good things to do and they make good experiences for volunteers and for your organization, and they make volunteers actually be more valuable in your organization. Orientation, supervision, evaluation are all really important parts of all of that, but also they are good at mitigating risk as well, because it's opportunity to clarify your expectations right up front in orientation. You do an onboarding with them and tell them exactly what you need out of them. That gets reinforced through supervision and evaluation. At an orientation up front, that's also a good opportunity to go through your policies and your risk management procedures, and any statutes that might inform their work, like mandated reporting or HIPAA requirements. I honestly think ongoing supervision, good ongoing supervision, is the best component of risk management. And supervisors should be expected and empowered to give their volunteers timely and effective feedback, so that good behavior is reinforced, and bad behavior, you have a path towards changing it, and giving some coaching along the way. And finally, like, not surprising people that they've been doing the wrong thing for a long time and now they're potentially getting fired from their volunteer job. Good supervision ensures that that doesn't happen. Another topic, a lot of folks are just interested in short-term volunteering, which can mean, you know, you're doing a lot of screening on folks who aren't sticking around for a long time. It's just another opportunity to look at, are there ways to do abbreviated or more informal screening processes depending on their role and level of supervision? Like I mentioned, if we're having someone come in and phone bank once, we're not going to do a sit-down interview with them. But just keep in mind, you don't want to sacrifice good risk management in order to involve volunteers in shorter term positions. It's better to find positions that work for the shorter term, for the abbreviated screening, right? So rather than, oh, we really want to get this person in, we don't want to invest all the time in screening and onboarding and training them, but they're only going to be here for a week. Rather than thinking, I'm going to sacrifice the screening and all of the good policies and framework we have in place, what's a good volunteer position that's low risk that would work for someone who's only here for a week, so that you don't have to do all the screening for them. And then if it's not feasible to invest the amount of screening and supervision and training that you need in a short-term volunteer, maybe reserve that role for people who can make a longer time commitment that fits with all of the risk management that you need to do. Okay, so going through just some steps to manage risk, your handouts, especially handouts 6 and 7, have tools for conducting risk management assessments. We won't go through all of it now in the interest of time, but on the left-hand side of handout 6, you can see the duties of the position. On the right side, check how any risks are being screened and managed. So you've got some good stuff in your handouts to do a little more of this. But basically going through reviewing that position description, how are you screening for the position? How are you orienting your volunteers, and what information are you providing in that orientation? How will you be training them? And then how will you be supervising and evaluating them are kind of the different components that you'll be thinking about. So in this concept, we've discussed our overall, at this point, we've discussed our overall approach to risk management assessment, how you evaluate your risk, how you manage the risks, how you make policies, how you screen, how you use position descriptions, training being important. So you've done everything you can, right? But then as I mentioned earlier, you can't totally control or eliminate all risks. So let's look at what to have in place if problems inevitably occur, because they will. So last concept, organizations need written and shared procedures on how to handle liability and emergency situations. So just think through and reflect. Do you know, just generally in your organization, do folks who supervise your volunteers know? Do your volunteers themselves know how to act if there's an emergency, how to deal with a person who's injured on the premises, whether it's the volunteer or a client or a community member? Do you have guidance for how to preserve physical evidence, as well as recording your recollections? So after something happens, an incident happens, it's super important to sit down and just make some notes about what happened and talk to the folks who were involved, get notes from them, sign off on what happened. How are you going to discuss a liability incident with, for example, are you calling the police? What are your interactions? What's your policy for interacting with the police? With the media, I guess, depending on how big the incident is, and whether or not you're under like a microscope. I can tell you at Planned Parenthood, we definitely are. So we have a lot of processes around dealing with the media. Who gets notified in the case of an emergency? Do you have procedures to follow in some sort of natural disaster or otherwise? And then how do you deal with displays of racism, whether overt or unintended? So do you have anti-discrimination policies? And then from there, are you actually providing training and support to all of your staff and program participants around microaggressions, around bias? And then how do you recover from incidents where someone does exhibit a microaggression or does exhibit an incident of bias? How do you deal with all of that? So it's good to think through, like, how are you going to approach all these potential eventualities, right? Do you put that into policies? Do you have a crisis management policy? It's a good thing to think through in advance and have some sort of plan for all of it. So in short, be prepared for anything. Have your documents and procedures in place for any of these events your organization might go through. And then be ready to share these procedures with your volunteers if it makes sense to do so, whether it's the written document or some sort of explanation of what to do in the case of X. So like example, again, that Drea shared earlier of being assaulted in the community, if there is a high probability that could happen just because of your client base or the community within that you're in, how do you first flag that that's a possibility for everyone, and then give them resources for what to do if that happens? So some examples of how we've done that at Planned Parenthood, we have a big part of a volunteers orientation is their security training, because we do, like I mentioned, we have protesters. They've over the years been very active and dangerous, or they've been a little bit more quiet. But we give volunteers training and just some tips on how to stay safe. Don't wear your name badge outside of the building. Don't interact with the protesters. If you feel like someone's following you, do this. If you feel like, keep a certain amount of, if you drive, keep a certain amount of gas in your gas tank. Here are your emergency contacts, making sure people have like a quick flip grid of, here's our security guard, here's our security director. Here, if you feel like you need to reach out to local law enforcement or fire department or what have you. Here's how to do that. We do security drills, we do fire drills, we do weather drills. So all of those things, but then also like, what are our crisis communication plans? What do we do if we need to shut down a facility quickly? And these, as I mentioned, we're in the Minneapolis area. These have become super important, especially because of the killing, if you've heard of the killing of Dante Wright a week ago by the police in one of the suburbs near Minneapolis. That's right by one of our clinics. So like we had to think through, there were a lot of protests in the area. There's a lot of police showing up. There were a lot of military now, National Guard. How do we make sure people are informed? What are our processes for if we need to shut down quickly? Do we decide whether or not to join other community organizations and businesses in boarding up our windows? And how do we communicate with staff about that and with our volunteers? How do we make sure if we do need to shut down quickly and a volunteer is showing up to their shift, did someone tell them so that they aren't showing up to a boarded up building and no one there? If bus lines get shut down, how are people going to get home safely? All that sort of stuff. And then how are we going to communicate through all of this? So I'm feeling very attuned to all of that this week. Okay, so anything that's, I mean, kind of in a nutshell, just being prepared is a lot of the name of the game in risk management here. So we talked about emergency weather plan, check the weather, emergency numbers, medical kits, carrying a cell phone on you, wearing proper equipment and safety gear, reviewing current policies and updating them, and make sure you're thinking of your volunteers. That's the other thing, especially in a large organization like ours. We cover 5 states, we have 500 staff, see, tens of thousands of patients every year, have thousands of program participants. Sometimes in thinking about all of that, the volunteers get forgotten about. And that's something that when I was in charge of the program was always a frustration for me, because I wasn't always at the table when these policies and when these emergency action plans were put into place. So I'd hear about them after and think, well, I needed to know this so I could tell you how to be prepared for the volunteers. So that's really important, is making sure that they're kept in mind throughout it all. So just in closing, and then we'll open up for any questions. I asked you at the beginning how you felt about risk management. After going through this, thinking through everything, I'm kind of wondering if you could go to Menti in closing. How are you feeling about risk management now? Are you Tony the Tiger, feeling great? So, kind of need to think on it a little more? Or are you totally freaked out, SpongeBob in the ground, nope, not feeling good about any of this? I won't be offended if you are. It's a lot to take in and think about. So as we're kind of closing this, good. I'm glad people are feeling great and so, totally fair. So just in closing, preventive risk management practices, like I said at the beginning, shouldn't cause you anxiety or stress. Rather, I'm hoping that you feel empowered to feel like you're doing everything you can to protect your clients, your volunteers, your staff, and your organization. So doing that, it's a good part of caring for all of your people and everything you do. Additionally, doing all this stuff can enhance the quality of the work of your organization, which is good too. So also want to acknowledge we covered a lot today. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by where to go with all of this, a good first step is to just look at any low-hanging fruit. What's something that's out there, it's been bugging you, but it would be the easiest kind of thing to just sit down, hammer out a plan, and you'll be good to go. Getting position descriptions in order if you don't have them, for example, might be a good step. Coming up with a policy for how you screen people could be another good step. So with that concludes the presentation portion. So does anyone have, oh, Carolyn in the chat, totally freaked, but I will manage. Okay, well, try to get into the manage part of it, lessen the freaked out part of it. There's, and just want to acknowledge, like I said, you can't control, there's no way you can control for everything. So just try to understand what's out there in front of you.
Raise my hand.
Yeah, Cynthia. Cynthia, did you want to share something or ask something?
I'm wondering about the potential assault what does take place? How does a volunteer handle that? And what goes forward after such a possible event?
Right, and that's a really good question. Would anyone like to share what you do in your organizations? I could share with mine, but I think it might be helpful to hear, since you all kind of work in similar fields and organizations, it might be helpful to hear from your colleagues. Does anyone have a good policy or just a general approach to how you deal with the possibility of your volunteers or your staff being assaulted while they're coming to your organization or on the job?
Our approach is to set up things so assault is unlikely. As such, we don't allow staff to meet with anybody outside of our actual physical facility, and we have windows and whatnot. There's no real privacy, visual privacy in our facility, so things can't as likely escalate.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. So that's thinking
Our staff
through.
mentions also our staff is trained in MOAB training, which is basically how to get away from people if it looks like there's about to be an assault.
Sure.
Highly recommend it.
Awesome. Thank you, team.
So we're a smaller community center up here in Reno, and we're kind of the same mind. It's a very open facility, and while we do have doors that can close for some one-on-one peer support, so like when my staff or volunteers go out to do, say, outreach, because we do outreach to some of the transient encampments and that kind of thing, I always make sure that they do not go alone, that they are in contact with us, and we try and do it from a sense of preventative measures and not letting it, not really letting things get to the point where they will escalate or where it's likely to escalate anyways. I am interested in that MOAB training, so I'm going to look into that, however. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Aaron. And thanks for the link. The link to MOAB training is in the chat if you missed it. So yeah, I think a lot around like, what's your security camera situation and or what's your visibility into where work is happening. I think just ultimately like equipping people with the knowledge of what could happen, but then giving them some tips on where to go from there. Who are their contacts? Who do they reach out to in that situation? Do you advise that they call the police? Do you advise that they contact someone who works in security or a colleague? If your first automatic response is to not call the police, because that's something that I think in a lot of communities may not be the best first step. What are your supports? What are the supports for folks? Who should they call? Who's going to come in to support and work with them to be safe or to reconcile with what happened? Any other thoughts on that question? And if not, any other questions for me? I know we're coming right up. Got about 5 minutes here.
I just want to say I'm grateful for this end conversation, because you've helped me realize things that we don't, like, we have a newer location. We don't have a weather drill. We don't have these kind of situations. So I'm really grateful because you helped plant in some thoughts that if there was a volunteer here and we as a staff haven't established something, then how the heck can we expect them to? So there's just a gained overall knowledge. So I appreciate it.
Good. Awesome. Yeah. And I encourage you all to just be thinking, be continuously curious, and start from wherever you are. So if you're kind of thinking on some brand new things, just start to build in whatever's doable for you. And you'll slowly get better over time. You'll get there eventually. All right. Well, you've been an awesome group. I want to turn it back over. I assume you have some evaluations or some other housekeeping things at the end. So Chris or Cindy, Wendy, is there anything else we need to do to close it out here? There's some more good stuff coming up in the chat. Timothy shared another resource, Pathway to Violence. So with that, I can emphasize, reach out to your colleagues too, because they have great ideas and great resources and can be just a wonderful resource to you as well. And Cindy, I think you're off chat, so or off mute. So take it away here.
No, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone. I will have this recording up on that webpage that we all shared, and for the next session, as soon as I have the handouts, they'll go up there as well. Chris and I are here for any questions you might have. I haven't kept track of the whole chat, but I am going to save the chat, and if that's helpful to anyone, I can also post that somewhere where you can reach it. But otherwise, we'll see you. Oh, Chris did have to jump off early. The first, what are they called? Ask the Expert question, I think is coming up, and I have to look at that webpage again, but I will send a reminder out about that as well. I think it's coming up fairly soon, before the end of the month, that I have to look. So
Yep,
anyway,
it's on
me by email.
It's on Wednesday, April 28th from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m.
Perfect. Perfect, thanks. Still having that furnace installed, so I'm staying on mute. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and well.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.
All right, thank you.
Bye.